two receivers early on. You draft a running back with your fourth pick of the 2019 draft. I think it's very clear the Ravens are doing as much as they can in their eyes to build around Lamar Jackson. And I think with two wide receivers being drafted in their first three picks, I think that kind of kills the idea that all they're going to do is run the ball, because if that were truly the case, then you wouldn't draft those guys so early. So
it was fascinating to watch Dennis Kolatzos' Twitter line at that point with the Joe Flacco, like, hey, you could help me out a little bit here. But, and I know we've talked about that year after year. It is nice that they have obviously said Lamar's our guy, and this is the way we're going to build it to win. And we're going to build it differently than everybody else. And everything we predicted the last couple months, to some degree, we saw that over the weekend.
Well, I mean, they added two wide receivers, though, so it shows that they're not going to just run the ball. They're going to be run first. We knew that. I think that was pretty obvious from the moment that they, not just talking about Lamar Jackson, but the fact that they promoted Greg Roman and kept him instead of going with Marty Morningwig or continuing to go with Marty Morningwig. So I think you had to build around Lamar Jackson. Whether you believe in him or not, you need to go all in on it, because if you're not going to, what was the point of drafting him last year? So I like the fact that they added a ton of speed. We talked a little bit about Hollywood Brown at the end of last week when the Ravens took him 25th overall, had a chance to meet him at Owings Mills on Friday, and certainly he made a good impression. But you look at the speed he brings, he's a shiftier guy, explosive, smaller, and then with their second, third-round pick, they add Miles Boykin, who is more of the mold of big-time upside guy in terms of size. He ran really well at the Combine, better than anyone thought he would. And while he wasn't wildly productive in his career at Notre Dame, he had a really strong senior season that he kind of broke out. And he's one of those guys that doesn't have an overwhelming pedigree coming out of college, but you look at the physical tools, you look at how he played his final year at Notre Dame, and you see more upside there. Probably, he might be, as far as wide receivers the Ravens have drafted, he might have as much upside as anyone they've had. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to make it, but you can see a skill set in terms of size and speed, had good hands at Notre Dame, needs to be more consistent, needs to refine the route running, but you look at what Hollywood Brown can bring from a speed and explosive standpoint, and Miles Boykin, who maybe doesn't step in from day one and be a starter, but I think the upside is there that you kind of look at the measurables, you look at everything, and say if he continues to improve and he can build on what he did last year at Notre Dame after a pretty quiet start to his collegiate career, then you might have something there. So you got to build around Lamar Jackson, and we said, or I said it, as soon as they drafted him last year, kind of in response, kind of in shock to a very clear signal they were moving on from Joe Flacco, that you need to do a better job building around him than you did around Flacco the last 4 or 5 years, and I think the Ravens took some meaningful steps in doing that, and it's very clear, kind of from a universal standpoint. I mentioned the two receivers. Justice Hill, the running back they took from Oklahoma State in the 4th round, he ran the fastest 40 time of any running back at the Combine. It's clear they prioritize speed, and I think when you look at in today's NFL, that's not a bad way to go. Now, you have to see it all come together, and it's going to begin and end with Lamar Jackson's development, but at the very least, the Ravens have some more pieces around him now that you feel more confident in his ability to maximize whatever his ceiling is ultimately going to be.
He is Luke Jones. He is Luke at WNST.net and Baltimore. Luke out on Twitter. The Ravens will be gathering all of these guys. We're trying to get familiar with all of these names, but you mentioned the edge rusher and where we were with Suggs being out and replacement players. We went back to that draft, I believe it was 2015, where every single departed player, there was a replacement player selected for. I don't know that we went, toe for toe, name for name, faceplate for faceplate above lockers, but to bring in an edge rusher that everyone was sort of universally like, hey, we think this kid can do it at this level. I liked what I heard about Jalen Ferguson, right? And you love the nickname and you love all of that. He's going to be a guy. A few people said he would be the steal of all these guys. He would be the guy with the upside that I read over the weekend.
Yeah, it's funny. I've seen some of those, but I've also seen some other reports that they think he needs to be a little more refined with his technique. He's a bull rush guy. He really, you watch his tape at Louisiana Tech, he was the kind of guy who out-physicaled a lot of offensive tackles that he went up against. And by the way...
And that might not have happened at Alabama if he went to Auburn, right?
Right. And I want to be very clear about that. That's not a bad thing necessarily. I'm just saying he's going to have to find other ways in addition to doing that to continue to be as productive as he was at Louisiana Tech. And my goodness, he broke Terrell Suggs' Division I career sacks record. So very, very productive player, and certainly someone who fits the description of not a workout warrior like a lot of guys tend to be when they climb up draft boards, but someone who is just really, really productive over the course of his collegiate career. I mean, his sack totals, freshman year 6, sophomore year 14.5, junior year 7, 17.5 his senior year. So it just speaks to how productive he was. I know Wink Martindale and the Ravens put out a video inside the draft room of Wink Martindale talking to him and said that was the best pass rushing type interview he's ever had. So I think it's clear that Ferguson is someone who really loves rushing the passer. The sack total makes that a pretty good indication, but he is someone who's going to have to refine his technique. There are people who say, they don't love his athleticism, although you look at the size, 6'5", 275. He did get bigger toward the end of his collegiate career. So it'll be interesting to see what the Ravens decide to do with him from a training standpoint. Does he try to trim a little bit of weight? Because there was talk about the overwhelming sentiment for him was that he was more of a 4-3 D end. So the Ravens will use him as a rush linebacker in their base, but it's not a big deal because they're in their sub package so much now. So he'd line up at D end in the sub package. So I think he's someone who certainly can be productive, certainly can be a starting caliber edge defender for them sooner rather than later, especially when you consider how bare the cupboard is and how unproven the likes of Tyus Bowser and Tim Williams are. So Ferguson's going to come in and have every opportunity, but I think there is some debate as far as how high his ceiling is because, as you mentioned, it's one thing to play for Louisiana Tech and just overwhelm offensive tackle after offensive tackle in kind of a smaller conference. It's another thing to do that in the NFL on a weekly basis. So he's going to have to refine and expand upon his pass rushing moves, but that's typically the case for every pass rusher. So we'll see how it plays out. But I do think depending on how high anyone was on Jalen Ferguson, I think there was a sense that most people viewed him as either a late first-round guy or a second-round guy. So to get him 85th overall in the third round, you'll take that. And certainly we'll see how he plays out. And, you hope that he is closer to being in the vicinity of, eventually, maybe not Terrell Suggs, but, go down the list of some of the other good pass rushers the Ravens have had over the years. You hope that it's more like that and less like, say, a Courtney Upshaw, which, was an okay player for 4 years, but certainly didn't move the meter in a dramatic way. So I think that's what you're always trying to figure out with any of these problems.
Yeah, who's the star here, right? I mean, you get the 25th player, the 85th player, the 90th, and then once they get in, whether they were the 113th player or not, that doesn't mean Justice Hill can't run for 1,200 yards next year, right? So I look at all of these names and say they're just a bunch of names, and 23, 24 years into this, man, I used to have all these rookies come out 2 weeks from now and do a show with me and get to know them and all of that. That's not where we are. We get to know them the minute they're drafted when their name's Hollywood, right? In the modern era, finding film on these guys, finding stories about these guys, finding people to talk about these guys, finding these guys talking. All of that, we've come a long way from Brandon Williams doing handstands on videos, right? Even 5-6 years later, there's just so much information about all these guys. I could sit here and read about Ben Powers for quite some time for being a guard and taking the late in the fourth round or whatever it was, right?
Oh, there's no shortage of information and video on all of these guys. You can find video that makes all of these guys look like they're going to be future All-Pros, and you can find, maybe not video, but you can find enough of so-called evaluators out there,
anecdotal evidence,
bloggers, whomever, who will say, "I don't like this guy." I mean, you'll find a wide, varying range of opinion on these prospects, and that's a good thing. If everyone agreed, it would be really dull. So I think there's certainly upside. There's certainly needs that were addressed by the Ravens, and there's certainly I think they're, because of just the nature of some of the positions that they drafted, specifically the wide receivers, there is very much a boom or bust nature to this draft class, I think. You look at all the picks they made, who would you say is the safest pick maybe? Maybe Ben Powers in the fourth round being a 3-year starter at Oklahoma. You would think maybe his floor is at least to be a top reserve and his ceilings to be a guy who's going to be a 10-year starter. I mean, I'm not saying I know which of those he's going to be, but you kind of look at him, and that's what you look at. But, when you're talking about a Marquise Brown with his size, Justice Hill, running back who's undersized, Miles Boykin, who has the measurables but didn't have the overwhelming production at the collegiate level. You're talking about some guys who have some enticing ceilings. There's no question about that, but you're also talking about guys who could end up not making it, and then the draft looks way different. So,
but it's fascinating to me.
I'm not the guy who's going to grade a draft.
Right,
but
and a team that works so hard to get these third and fourth round picks, right? Like that sweet spot between 85 and 125 where they picked 5 times. They've done well there. They've done way better there than a lot of other teams have done, than they've done in the second round, quite frankly, right? So not having a second-round pick, you would say, well, did they get the pick among the best players? They only had 25 off of the top, or one player at 25 of the top 84 taken off the board, right? So you shouldn't look at this on paper and give it one of those Browns check marks and say they stole the draft. They didn't pick 3 times in the first day and a half. You know what I mean? Like that's just not what this draft was going to be. This draft was going to be about fourth-round guards, right? I sort of knew that all along, right?
Well, I mean, it's one thing to say what position. I mean, I think it was pretty obvious they had to draft a couple wide receivers, and they did that, and they did it early to their credit. They didn't do the thing that they've done so many times over the years where you take a wide receiver in the 5th round or the 6th round, and then you wonder why he doesn't develop. Well, because he was passed over so much, and he wasn't that good, and your organization doesn't really have much of a reputation for developing wide receivers. So I like that they did that, but your overall point is spot on. I mean, really, that's why I wrote late last week at WNST.net that you really had to view Lamar Jackson as part of this draft class because they gave up their second-round pick to get him last year. So it really is a case of trying to maximize the value you have. They moved back to take Marquise Brown. They moved back a few spots to take him, so they picked up the extra 4th-round pick and an extra 6th-round pick, and then they ended up moving up to get Miles Boykin. So,
well, to your point, they won the draft last year because we woke up the day after and they had 2 guys on the first night. Anybody that gets 2 guys on the first day, you feel like, wow, they got 2 of the guys I've been talking about since January. They must be better, and that's the way. To your point, that's why we don't sit here and report card these things on Monday morning, or people come up and ask me how I think they did. I mean, I think they got what they wanted, right? And I always sort of defer to that. They put a whole lot more time into it than we do, as evidenced last Wednesday when Eric DeCosta toured us around, right? So, they knew what they needed to do. We had talked about wide receiver. I think for all of us, the question is, do you want to throw the ball or not? They said they wanted to throw the ball. They didn't do a whole lot of it last year, but last year and this year are going to be different.
Yeah, and they're still going to, to be very clear, they're still going to be a run-first offense. I think that's obvious. I just think you're going to see it's not going to be the 2-to-1 ratio that we saw for large chunks of the second half of the season. I think you're going to see, I don't know, if I had to guess right now, 55-45, something in that neighborhood, which is still way more than most teams run the football here in 2019. But I think you're going to see more balance, and the fact that they drafted a Marquise Brown, that gives you a playmaker that you can throw deep to, or throw a hitch to, or a bubble screen, different things of that nature. They'll probably have him run some jet sweeps, and I know the Ravens even talked about that. The brass talked about that after selecting him. So he's the kind of guy that you can get creative with. And then Boykin is more of that size outside receiver that, frankly, they didn't have on their roster. I mean, you look at the receivers that they've collected, even including Seth Roberts coming over from Oakland, a bunch of slot guys. So Boykin is a guy who you can line up on the outside and is 6'4" and 220, and you're hoping he's going to catch 50-50 balls and high point the ball. And he had a reputation for having good hands at Notre Dame, didn't have many drops in his senior season.
Built more like a tight end, quite frankly.
Yeah, but he also ran a 4.4, so he's someone who can run. He, in fact, the way he ran really surprised a lot of people at Notre Dame. If you just go back and go visit some of the Notre Dame football fan sites and things of that nature, they were kind of blown away by how well he tested. So you get two wide receivers with diverse skill set, and you hope that they work out. Now, realistically speaking, if we're looking at this and being pragmatic and realistic about this, probably only one of them is going to work out. I mean, and that's just the nature of the beast. But, and this is where I will tip my cap to Eric DeCosta and the Ravens, as someone who's been incredibly critical of them and their handling of the wide receiver position for a very long time. I give them credit that they took a couple swings here, because you're never going to remedy the problem if you don't try. And that's really what it's come down to more than anything. You can keep harping on Rashad Perriman as much as you want. You can keep talking about Mark Clayton, even though that was 14 years ago. You can go talk about Travis Taylor, who was 19 years ago. But when you consider the Ravens in this draft come away with two wide receivers selected in the first 3 rounds, that equaled the total of wide receivers they've selected in the first 3 rounds in the John Harbaugh era heading into this draft. So you're talking over an 11-year period, they took 2 wide receivers in the first 3 rounds. Torrey Smith, who worked out very nicely, and Rashad Perriman, who we know did not work out very, very well.
Well, it worked out good for the Browns last year.
Oh, yeah. Had a nice, God bless him, had a nice year last year, caught a touchdown against the Ravens in Week 17. But my point is, that is such a small sample, and DeCosta's talked about this on a couple occasions, that you're never going to remedy this issue. You're never going to turn a dramatic weakness into maybe not a strength, but let's just say less of a weakness if you don't start investing some meaningful capital in that position. So it was good to see that. Are there question marks about Marquise Brown? Yes, absolutely. You're talking about a guy who is incredibly undersized at the wide receiver position. I mean, there's just no way around that. You can't say he's not. He's 5'9", 170 pounds. But
I stood next to him, and we're the same size.
Yeah, but that said, you're talking about someone who has incredible speed, great change of direction, assuming he's recovered from the Liz Frank injury. And that's another factor that, I'm sorry, I can't shake that as being a little bit concerned about that, because I've heard Jimmy Smith talk about the Liz Frank injury he had 5 years ago, that still bothers him from time to time. Doesn't mean you can't play. It doesn't mean you can't play at a high level, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. But with those risks, acknowledging those risks, acknowledging that there are some concerns, boy, you pop on the highlights and see what this guy was able to do at Oklahoma, you're impressed. In the case of Boykin, doesn't have the extensive, overwhelming production, although he caught 8 touchdowns his senior year at Notre Dame and had 870 yards and high points the ball and has hands that certainly are more highly regarded than Rashad Perriman's were a few years back. Then I think you've added 2 really interesting weapons in the passing game, and then you throw Justice Hill in there, even though he didn't catch a ton of balls at OK State. Talking to Joe Ortiz, they like what he can do as a receiver out of the backfield, so there's another element you add to this offense. So, it's all about collecting guys who can do different things. And, we saw, say what you want about his passing, Lamar Jackson in the open field as a runner at the quarterback position, it's pretty unique. You can name probably 4 or 5 guys in the last 20, 25 years who even belong in that territory. I mean, okay, RG3, Michael Vick. If you want to go back as long as Randall Cunningham, certainly Russell Wilson showed impressive mobility before. He's kind of relied more on being a pocket passer. So, Cam Newton, but you're not talking about a huge group of guys to compare to. So you want to add to that. And DaCosta talked about the fact that some of the great offenses that they've faced the last few years, you just see the speed. You and I have talked at various points. I think back to the Kansas City Rams Monday night game last year.
Track me.
And I was just thinking, boy, these guys are playing a different sport than the Ravens play.
Well, I mean, I think I go back to the AFL and the funny uniforms and throwing the football and Lance Allworth. I mean, or at any point in my youth, any WAC football game, right? Any Utah, San Diego State, middle of the night, Fresno State, the score's 51-37, and it's only the third quarter, right? Like that's.
And look, and I'm not saying that ultimately is better football, but I think you have to be realistic about where the Ravens have been over the last 5 or 6 years, and I'm not putting it all on Joe Flacco, far from it. But I think in general, we can all look at these rosters over the last 5, 6 years and say, haven't had as much speed, haven't had as much playmaking ability. They've been in games, they've competed. There's no shame in that. But at any point, have you really felt that strongly about their chances and their ceiling, let's say, their overall potential? And I think it's been lukewarm in that regard. So add some speed, add some athleticism, add some playmaking ability, and see what happens. And that's not to say that this is all going to work out. The Ravens are still very much zigging while everyone else is zagging in terms of what they're going to try to do offensively. But I think you have some horses in place now who can make this thing really interesting. And I don't know if it's all going to work, but I think we're definitely going to see some highlights and definitely going to see some really interesting things. And if Lamar Jackson does take a step forward, which I want to remind everyone, he has 8 career NFL starts under his belt before anyone is making up their mind.
And won most of them.
Yeah, exactly. Let's be clear about that. I mean, it's fine to have questions, but let's not completely just seal his fate and make our decision about what he's going to be. But now I think you have some really intriguing pieces that you put around him, in addition to having the strong running game and in addition of what he can do athletically speaking. And now I think you have more of a jumping-off point where you can start seeing some strides. And that doesn't mean the Ravens are going to be poised to win the Super Bowl this year, but if you can see growth, and then you're reminded that you're still going to have a lot of cap flexibility the next couple years, and you're still going to have more players you can bring in, and you still are going to have a 22-year-old quarterback who you're hoping and you're confident, if you're the Ravens, that he's going to get better. Boy, you open up a really interesting, exciting window to really build and add to your roster even more over the next 2 or 3 years, and you hope at some point over that time you're really going to be in a position where you have a really good chance to win a Super Bowl. And I think that's what the Ravens are. That's what they're doing right now. They still have questions. They didn't address inside linebacker because, frankly, they didn't really love this class once you got beyond Devin White and Devin Bush. So that's a question. They didn't really draft a center. Ben Powers is going to be someone who's going to compete at left guard. So that doesn't mean Matt Skura is by default just going to be the guy. I think Bradley Bozeman will have a chance to compete. Who knows? Maybe they acquire a veteran or bring someone in who gets cut because some other team drafted a younger center. But they still have question marks. I mean, it's not as though I suddenly look at this receiver group just because they drafted 2 guys and say, wow, that's really going to be a strength. You hope eventually it'll be a strength, but that's still going to be a question mark. So I don't look at this team right now and say, I think they have a great chance to go to a Super Bowl, but I think there is a lot of upside, and I think there's a lot of intrigue, and I think there's a lot of potential for this team to really get better over the next couple years. Whereas, if you'd asked me that question 2 or 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I don't know. I just felt the Ravens were kind of in that in-between area where they were good enough to compete and be in the mix, but not good enough to get over the hump. And on the flip side, they weren't bad enough to get a top 10 pick consistently. So, I think now, even though I still don't know ultimately how I feel as far as how great they're going to be in 2019, I think you can see a ceiling there that maybe hasn't been there the last few years with some of these really special athletes that they've brought in and having the speed that they just haven't had here in a while. So, like I said, at the very least, even if it doesn't work, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch how this plays out over the next couple of years.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net, monitoring all things rookie camp this week, as well as Oriole baseball. Baltimore Positive is launched. We hope to see you on Thursday night with Dutch Rupersberger at Pizza John's. Come eat some pizza with us. I'll even let you get the meat sauce on it the way Luke does. Thursday night, 5 o'clock, all for There Goes My Hero to launch Baltimore Positive with my dear friend Don Moeller. There's a great piece up in the buyatoyota.com audio vault that you can hear right now if you wish. Also brought to you by our friends at Hammer and Nails, the ultimate man cave nirvana on the town center in Owings Mills. Manicure, pedicure, hair. I got to get my hat off to get my hair cut, but I'm getting my hair cut next week. Adult beverages, and don't forget the hot towel. Shave, relax, get it all done. Hammer and Nails, the ultimate man cave nirvana. Also brought to you by our friends at Curio Wellness in Timonium, the holistic spa with the top-of-the-line products with experienced pros. Yes, they have cannabis. Yes, they're committed to teaching folks about the medicinal cannabis ways for all patients. Anyone that wants to learn, stop in. The Curio Way is there, and Brian Sanderoff will be joining us later on this week as well. Don't forget the Modell Lyric. Lots of rock and roll this week. I've got some cool stuff up in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. Nothing better than chatting with Amit Zappa about how they're going to bring his father back to life this Friday down at the Modell Lyric. So, be looking for that out there. You'll hear Ahmed Zappa. You'll also hear Chips Enough from Enough's Enough. They're coming in for M3 this weekend. The Modell Lyric, Eddie B doing comedy next month. Bill Maher on June 9. JoJo Sywell, your daughter, will dig that on June 10th. And I have the weekend of June 13th circled because they're doing the Marvin Gaye musical Pride and Joy. Love me some Marvin Gaye. I'm into it. Weekend of June 13th. We'll be there for that. Diana Ross on June 30. The Queen. There's always magic at the Modell Lyric. Learn more at modell-lyric.com. My pal Court from Sporticulture came on last week. Was a great guest. Big Oiler fan, big football fan. And I don't know anyone that has more flowers than he does out of Walnut Springs. They do Sporticulture. I've still got the flowers on the set. They're purple. They still smell nice. And my cat hasn't eaten them all. He's doing lava lamps now. He does these really cool little planters that I can hold up on my cam for you. Sporticulture. That's sporticulture.com. Send, deliver. We had to deliver some flowers over the weekend. So one click away. Do it up. Sporticulture. Also, my pal Lee Tessier. I saw him up in Harford County last week. Selling my condo, selling your home, helping you acquire a home. It's what they've been doing for over 50 years. Helping local buyers and sellers just like you getting the best deals. They know about the laws. They know about all the paperwork. They know about all that stuff that goes into all those papers you have to sign. They know what all of it means. That's why I'm letting them handle my transaction. Lee Tessier and the Lee Tessier team. Learn more at leetessier.com. Luke, one more thing before we go that I just want to point out, because we were talking about the defense and we started to meander into the offense, and I think it's so much more fun to talk about the offense and the defense. But I looked up over the weekend and saw number one defense, right? Like every time they picked it, said they were number 9 on offense and number 1 on defense. And I thought, boy, that's a gaudy thing. And then I thought about, well, Weddle and Mosley and Suggs and all these guys that are gone, and Jimmy Smith a year older and all that stuff. But I did think to myself about the offense, and I thought, Miami's got to prepare right now, right? Arizona's up right after that. Those are the first 2 games. And I thought to myself, all these weapons, all this speed, this is going to be a nightmare for defensive coordinators on the other side trying to figure this out with the Ravens in the same way it was a nightmare down the stretch last year, even the Chiefs, right? You go out to Kansas City. Lamar did enough to win that game unless Mahomes was otherworldly, and he was at the end. But every single week, defensive coordinators were given fits, right on up until the Chargers figured it out and beat them in January here. But this is going to be a weekly theme we're going to be talking about as to what are the Dolphins going to do when Lamar Jackson and all this speed and Hollywood shows up and they start pitching the ball around and playing rugby.
Oh, there's no question about that. I mean, And it really goes back to what Eric DaCosta said on Saturday, how they've watched some of these teams that have just had these offenses that have so much speed, and they're enlightened and they're doing some different things, and they're adding some and incorporating some collegiate elements. And we've seen spread offenses, and RPOs have become all the rage over the last couple years, and we've seen various teams like San Francisco a few years back with the read option. That certainly the Ravens ran plenty of that last year, and
the Ravens would have lost the Super Bowl if they would have run it 4 more times at the goal line, right?
Right, exactly. So, but your point is spot on in the sense of even if you are not a big believer in Lamar Jackson, big picture, on a week-to-week basis, he is an absolute nightmare for a team to try to deal with. I mean, you don't see it. I've used the analogy a few times talking about comparing it to a baseball pitcher where you have someone who throws 100 and has just an absurd breaking pitch. Or think about someone who has an incredible knuckleball. Just think of something. You just don't see it often. And when you're talking about Lamar Jackson, and in the case of the Chargers, they saw him twice in 3 weeks. Now, what did they figure some things out, and they ran more dime and even some quarter defense with 6-7 defensive backs on the field? Sure. I mean, I think you have to give them credit. One, you also have to have the personnel to run that kind of a defense. But two, I think there was such just a sense of, all right, you've seen that guy. It's like seeing that 100-mile-per-hour fastball the second or third time through the order. You see it a couple times, and the novelty of it wears off a little bit more. But in the case of the Arizona Cardinals, who play the Ravens once every 4 years, you're not going to have any kind of great grasp on how Lamar Jackson plays. They'll lean on Terrell Suggs as much as they can. Later in the season, the L.A. Rams will lean on Eric Weddle as much as they can. But there very much is a sense of until you've seen it, there's going to be a lot of, I don't know if fear is the right word, but anxiety, I think, is a word that a lot of defenses are going to, frankly, they're going to be experiencing that because of Lamar Jackson, because of Hollywood Brown, because of the collection of running backs the Ravens have. It's just very different than anything else you're seeing in the NFL. And that doesn't mean it will result in a Super Bowl one day, but it might. And it's in the meantime, on a week-to-week basis, it's going to be a team that you don't want to face. It's very much like Navy. Navy may not win a national championship, but what Ken Niumatalolo and Paul Johnson before that with the triple option, they wreak havoc on a defense. They put a lot of pressure on a defense, and I think the Ravens' offense, now that they've added some athletes on top of what they already had and what they're already doing with their offensive system, it is going to be really interesting to see how teams prepare. And, yeah, there'll be some teams like the Chargers that have the personnel to figure it out and have the wherewithal to figure it out. But as we saw down the stretch last year, there were also plenty of teams that didn't play good, disciplined run defense, and they were completely gouged. So you're going to find that. And I think for some of these teams that, it's one thing to talk about a Pittsburgh, let's say, who I would have to think the Steelers trading up to get a sideline-to-sideline running kind of inside linebacker like Devin Bush. You had to think Lamar Jackson was at least part of the equation that made Pittsburgh value trading up there because they know they're going to see him twice a year for however many years moving forward. So I think from that standpoint, there are a lot of teams that maybe they're not spending their entire offense preparing or off-season preparing for the Ravens. I'm not going to go that far, but they're spending some extra time on the Ravens. There's no doubt. And to your point, when you're talking about Miami, Arizona, two teams who were not good football teams last year, two teams that are rebooting with new quarterbacks, and you really don't expect them to be very good, they're certainly looking at having to play the Ravens, week 1 in Miami's case, week 2 in Arizona's case, and they're the ones really thinking, my goodness, what is this offense going to look like? They know it'll probably look something like last year, but you also have to think with Greg Roman having an entire offseason, Lamar Jackson having an entire offseason to prepare as the starting quarterback, they're really going to build upon that thing. And if nothing else, it's going to be very difficult to prepare for because there are just so many different, so many different athletes now that they've added 3 more to the mix over the course of the weekend, and just so many different ways the Ravens can try to attack you. And that's also without taking into account the possibility that Lamar Jackson does get better as a passer, which don't completely dismiss. If he does that, then boy, this offense could really take off.
Well, if they weren't banking on him getting better, they wouldn't have drafted him last year. Big winners last year and a little bit more quietly into the draft this year. You can find Luke at WNST.net, and Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. All of our WNST coverage brought to you by our friends at Royal Farms. Real fresh, real fast, the tasty Kona blend in your cup, but more importantly, the ROFO Rewards Card. This is how you get you pump your gas, you get your coffee, you get your Western fries and fried chicken free when you use the app or the card. There's a couple ways to do it. It's Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. Nice job by Project Runway and our friends taking care of the beautiful animals on Saturday night at the Royal Farms Arena. Give them a thumbs up as well for all that they're doing. Strategic Factory putting together an unbelievable Baltimore positive logo for me for our event on Thursday night at Pizza John's with Dutch Rupersberger. We hope to see everybody out for the Bone Marrow Registry on Thursday. Strategic Factory. They do hats, they do shirts, they do printing, and they do it with the strategy that creates your masterpiece. Learn more at strategicfactory.com. I'll be telling you more about that. Also getting some new WNST swag and some Baltimore Positive swag, too. A few Baltimore Positive hats are going to look good around here as well. Appreciate Keith and our whole team over at Strategic Factory, Jeff, Fawn, everybody for touring us around and getting me new business cards that I bragged about that have my Baltimore Positive logo on them. I'm holding them up now. See? It's cool. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking Baltimore sports.